The first photo she sent me wasn't supposed to exist. It showed up at 2:14 in the morning, buried deep in the wedding gallery like it belonged there, like it was just another perfect moment captured from what I believed was the happiest day of my life. At first, nothing about it stood out, just another image, just another memory frozen in time. But something about it felt off, like my brain recognized a problem before I consciously saw it. I clicked it without thinking, expecting smiles, laughter, something safe. Instead, I found something that didn't fit, something that made my stomach tighten before I even understood why. This wasn't an edited photo. It wasn't framed or polished or touched with the soft golden tones the rest of the gallery had. It was raw, unfiltered, almost like it had slipped through by accident. And maybe it had. I leaned closer to the screen, zooming in slowly, and that's when the image stopped being just a photo and started becoming something else entirely. Something that didn't belong to me, something that wasn't meant for me. That's the thing about moments caught on camera. They don't lie. They don't soften the truth. They don't protect you from what's actually happening when you're not looking. And in that single frame, I realized there had been something happening on my wedding day that I had completely missed. Something just outside the spotlight, just beyond the part of the story I thought I was living. This isn't just a story about a photographer making a mistake. It's about what happens when reality leaks through the cracks of a perfect illusion. Because once I saw that photo, everything I thought I knew started to shift. Every memory, every smile, every glance began to feel different, like I was replaying a version of events that wasn't entirely real. And the worst part wasn't just what I saw in that image, it was the feeling that followed. That quiet, creeping realization that if this one moment was captured, there might be more, and that maybe, just maybe, the truth had been there the entire time, waiting for me to finally notice it. Our wedding day had felt perfect in a way that's almost hard to explain now. It wasn't just that everything went according to plan, because it didn't. There were small things, little delays, minor mistakes, but none of it mattered. The air itself felt different, like everything was aligned for that one moment. I remember standing at the front, feeling my hands tremble slightly, not out of fear, but out of something deeper, something heavier. Anticipation, relief, hope. When she walked down the aisle, everything else disappeared. The noise, the people, the music, it all faded into the background. It was just her and me. At least, that's what I believed. Looking back now, I wonder how much I missed in that moment, how many things were happening outside of my focus while I was locked into that one perfect image of what my life was supposed to become. We had spent months planning everything, the venue, the decorations, the guest list, every detail carefully chosen to reflect us, or at least the version of us we thought we were. Hiring the photographer had been one of the most important decisions. We didn't want something staged or artificial. We wanted real moments, genuine emotions, something that felt alive. That's why we chose her. Lena had a reputation for capturing things others didn't see. Her portfolio was filled with images that felt intimate, almost intrusive in the best way, moments people didn't even realize were being documented. It felt special at the time, like she could preserve something deeper than just appearances. I remember telling someone that I trusted her completely, that she would capture the truth of the day. I didn't realize how literal that would become. During the wedding, she moved quietly, almost invisibly. I barely noticed her most of the time, which, in hindsight, is exactly what made everything possible. Because while I was living my moment, while I was caught up in what I thought was the most important day of my life, she was watching everything. Not just the obvious parts, but the parts that happen when people think no one is looking. And somewhere in all of that, something happened that I didn't see. Something that would later find its way into my hands in the form of a photo I was never meant to receive. The days after the wedding were filled with the kind of happiness that feels almost fragile, like if you think about it too much, it might disappear.
Messages poured in from friends and family, photos from guests started circulating, and everyone kept saying the same thing. It looked perfect, it felt perfect, it was perfect. I repeated those words in my head more than I can count, maybe because I needed them to be true. We talked about everything, the ceremony, the speeches, the little moments that stood out. She laughed easily, leaned into me the way she always had, and for a while, nothing felt out of place. If there were signs, I didn't see them, or maybe I chose not to. There's a kind of blindness that comes with happiness, a willingness to ignore anything that doesn't fit the narrative you've built. When Lena emailed us saying the gallery was ready, I was surprised. It had only been 10 days. Most photographers take weeks, sometimes months, but she sounded excited, almost eager. The message was short, simple, but something about it stuck with me. I couldn't wait to share these with you. At the time, it felt like passion, like pride in her work. Now, I hear it differently. Now it sounds like someone who needed to get something off their hands. We opened the gallery together that night, sat close on the couch, the room dim except for the glow of the screen. It felt like reliving the day, piece by piece, and for a while it was exactly what we expected. Beautiful, emotional, everything we had hoped. But then something shifted, subtle at first, a single image that didn't match the rest, and that's where everything began to unravel, even if I didn't realize it yet.
At first, I thought it was just a mistake. One unedited photo slipping through into the final gallery didn't seem like a big deal. It happens. People miss things. But this wasn't just unedited. It felt unfinished in a way that made it stand out immediately. The lighting was harsh, the framing slightly off, like it had been taken quickly, without intention. And yet there was something about it that drew me in. The setting was a hallway at the venue, one I barely remembered. It was tucked away from the main area, a quiet space that people used to step away for a moment, to breathe, to escape the noise. At first glance, it looked empty, just a corridor with soft shadows and a door at the end. But then I noticed movement. Two figures, partially obscured, standing close together. My eyes adjusted slowly, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. One of them was her, that much was clear. The dress, the posture, the way she stood, I would recognize it anywhere. The second figure took a moment longer, not because I didn't know him, but because my brain resisted the recognition. It didn't fit, it didn't belong in that context. But once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. It was him, my best man, the person I trusted more than almost anyone else, the person who stood beside me during the ceremony, who gave a speech about loyalty and friendship and everything we had been through together. And there they were, in that hallway, closer than they should have been. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was a misunderstanding, a moment taken out of context. But something about the way they stood, the lack of distance between them, made it impossible to ignore. It wasn't just proximity, it was familiarity. And that's when the unease started to grow into something much harder to dismiss. I didn't say anything at first. I just stared at the screen, trying to convince myself that I was reading too much into it, that there was a simple explanation, something harmless that would make sense once I thought about it logically. But logic didn't come easily in that moment. All I had was instinct, and my instinct was telling me that something was wrong. I leaned forward slightly, zooming in on the image, focusing on the details. The way his hand rested on her waist, not lightly, not casually, but with a kind of confidence that suggested it had been there before. Her body didn't pull away. If anything, she leaned into it, just slightly, but enough to make it clear that this wasn't unexpected, this wasn't new. I felt something shift inside me, something heavy and cold. "Wait," I said, quietly, almost to myself. She leaned closer, her shoulder brushing against mine as she looked at the screen. For a brief moment, I felt her body tense. It was subtle, but I noticed. "That's weird,"
she said, her voice too quick, too controlled. It didn't sound like confusion, it sounded like caution. I didn't respond. I just kept staring, letting the silence stretch between us, because in that silence something was starting to form, a thought I didn't want to think, a possibility I wasn't ready to face, and yet it was there, growing stronger with every second. I zoomed in further, focusing on their faces. Hers was partially turned away, but I could still see enough. There was no confusion there, no discomfort, just something calm, familiar. And that's when the moment stopped being ambiguous. That's when it stopped being something I could explain away. Because whatever was happening in that hallway, it wasn't accidental, it wasn't innocent. And deep down, I think I already knew that. I just wasn't ready to say it out loud. But the worst part wasn't even that photo, it was what came after. Because once I started looking, really looking, I realized that wasn't the only moment that had been captured, and the next one would remove any doubt I had left. My hand hovered over the trackpad for a second longer than it should have. I remember that clearly, the hesitation, like some part of me already knew that continuing would cross a line I couldn't come back from. But curiosity isn't always a choice. Sometimes it feels like gravity, pulling you forward whether you want it or not. I scrolled. At first, the images returned to normal. Smiles, laughter, familiar faces. For a brief moment, I almost felt relief, like maybe I had overreacted, like maybe that one image really had been nothing more than a strange angle, a misinterpreted moment. But then I saw it, another image that didn't belong. It was placed further down in the gallery, almost hidden between two perfectly edited shots. If I hadn't been paying attention, I might have missed it entirely. But now I was looking differently. Now I was searching. The second image was taken from a different angle, slightly further back, like the photographer had stepped into the hallway without being noticed. The lighting was dimmer, shadows stretching across the walls, creating a sense of distance, of separation from the rest of the event. And in that frame, there they were again. This time, there was no confusion, no ambiguity, no room for interpretation. They were closer than before, their bodies aligned in a way that made everything clear. His hand had moved, no longer resting on her waist, but pulling her closer. And her face, now fully visible, was turned towards his. I felt my chest tighten as I stared at the screen, my mind trying to reject what my eyes were clearly seeing. Because this wasn't just proximity, this wasn't just a moment that could be misunderstood, this was something else entirely, something undeniable. And then I noticed the final detail, the thing that made everything collapse at once. Their lips were inches apart, frozen in that space just before contact, a moment suspended in time, captured perfectly by someone who wasn't supposed to be there. And suddenly, everything around me felt distant. The room, the couch, even her presence beside me, all of it faded into the background as that image took over. Because in that single frame, I wasn't just looking at a mistake, I was looking at the truth. And the truth was something I wasn't ready for. I didn't breathe. I don't think I even blinked. My body felt locked in place, like if I moved even slightly, the reality in front of me would become permanent in a way I couldn't undo. Beside me, I could feel her shifting, small movements that felt louder than they should have in the silence that had taken over the room. "It's probably just timing," she said, her voice quieter now, less certain. "It just looks like that." I turned my head slowly to look at her. She still wasn't meeting my eyes. Instead, she was focused on the screen, but not in the same way I was. She wasn't studying the image, she was avoiding it, and that told me more than anything she could have said. I looked back at the photo, my mind racing through possibilities, searching for any version of events that didn't lead to the conclusion that was forming in my chest. But there wasn't one, not anymore. Because as much as I wanted to believe there was an explanation, something harmless, something innocent, the image didn't support that. It told a different story, one that didn't include me, one that existed entirely outside of the life I thought we were building together. My hand moved again, almost on its own, scrolling slightly forward, and that's when I saw the third photo. It was taken just seconds after the second one. Same hallway, same angle, same shadows stretching across the walls. But this time, there was no space between them, no moment before, no ambiguity. Their lips were pressed together, their bodies fully connected in a way that made everything irrelevant. It wasn't quick, it wasn't hesitant, it was intentional, familiar, real. And just like that, the last piece of doubt disappeared, because there was no way to explain that away, no way to pretend it was something it wasn't. I felt something inside me break, not at once, but in a slow, controlled way that hurt more than if it had shattered instantly. I turned to her again, this time holding her gaze when she finally looked at me. And in that moment, I didn't need words, because the truth was already there, written all over her face, and the only question left was how long it had been happening before I ever saw that photo.
"What is this?" The words came out steadier than I felt, but there was something underneath them, something sharp, something that couldn't be hidden no matter how calm I tried to sound. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked back at the screen, like she was seeing the image for the first time all over again, like she could somehow change what it showed just by staring at it long enough. "It's not what it looks like," she said finally, but the words felt automatic, rehearsed in a way that made them sound hollow, because it was exactly what it looked like. There was no other version of that moment, no alternate explanation that made sense. I waited, giving her the space to say something else, something real. But nothing came. The silence stretched again, heavier this time, filled with everything that wasn't being said. "Then what is it?" I asked, my voice quieter now, but no less intense. She shifted slightly, pulling her hands together in her lap, a small gesture that felt like she was trying to hold something in place, something that was slipping out of her control. "It just happened," she said. And I felt something inside me twist at those words. Because just happened isn't an explanation. It's an excuse, and not even a good one. "On our wedding day?" I asked, the disbelief finally breaking through. "That's when it just happened?" She flinched slightly at that, and for a second I thought she might actually tell me the truth, but instead she looked away again, her eyes focusing on something else in the room, anything but me. "It didn't mean anything," she added, almost as an afterthought. And that was the moment everything shifted completely. Because if it didn't mean anything, then why did it look like that? Why did it feel like that? Why did it happen at all? The words didn't match the reality I was staring at, and the gap between them is where everything started to fall apart. I leaned back slightly, creating a small distance between us, but it felt like miles, because suddenly I wasn't sitting next to the person I thought I knew. I was sitting next to someone who lived a moment I wasn't part of, someone who had crossed a line I didn't even know existed until now. And the more I thought about it, the more one question kept coming back, louder each time. If it happened then, how long had it been happening before that? I didn't need to ask the question right away. In fact, I think part of me didn't want to, because asking it would mean opening a door that couldn't be closed again, stepping into a version of reality that I wasn't ready to face. But the thought was already there, repeating itself over and over, growing stronger with each passing second. I looked back at the screen, at the sequence of images that had somehow made their way into a gallery that was supposed to be one of the most important days of my life. It felt almost surreal, like I was watching someone else's story unfold instead of my own. "How long?" The words came out before I could stop them, quieter than I expected, but heavy enough to fill the room. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she took a slow breath,
the kind people take when they're trying to prepare themselves for something they don't want to say. And that hesitation told me everything I needed to know. Because if it truly had been a one-time thing, if it had really just happened, there wouldn't have been a pause. There wouldn't have been that moment of calculation. "It's not like you think," she said again, but this time there was less conviction behind it, like even she didn't fully believe it anymore. I shook my head slightly, more to myself than to her. "Then tell me what it's like," I said, my voice steady but firm. "Because right now, all I have is what I'm seeing." She looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a moment I saw something in her expression that I hadn't seen before. Not just guilt, but fear. Not fear of me, but fear of the truth itself. "It wasn't supposed to go this far," she said finally, and those words landed harder than anything else she could have said, because they confirmed what I had been trying to avoid. This wasn't new. This wasn't a single mistake. This was something that had been building, something that had been allowed to grow until it reached a point where it couldn't be hidden anymore. And somehow, out of all the days it could have happened, it happened on the one day that was supposed to mean everything, the one day that was supposed to be about us. And that's when I realized something that made everything even worse. This wasn't just about what I had seen in those photos. It was about everything I hadn't seen. Every moment leading up to that, every interaction, every look that I had missed because I wasn't paying attention. And suddenly, the entire day started to feel different in my memory, like I was replaying it with new eyes, seeing things I hadn't noticed before. And the more I thought about it, the more I understood that those photos weren't the beginning of the story. They were just the moment it was finally exposed. The realization didn't come all at once. It settled in slowly, like a weight pressing down from every direction, making it harder to think, harder to breathe. I stared at the screen again, scrolling back and forth between the images, as if repeating them would somehow change what they showed. But they didn't. They stayed exactly the same, frozen in time, unchanging, undeniable. "How many times?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper now. She didn't respond right away, and that silence felt louder than anything she could have said, because by then I already knew the answer wasn't going to be something I could handle easily. And the longer she waited, the clearer it became that whatever she was about to say would only confirm what I had already started to understand. That this wasn't just a mistake, it wasn't just a moment, it was something real, something that had been happening behind my back, hidden in plain sight. And somehow, the only reason I knew about it now was because of a photographer who captured something she wasn't supposed to capture. A moment that slipped through the cracks and ended up in my hands when it never should have. "It started before the wedding." The words came out quietly, almost like she was hoping they wouldn't carry too far, like if she said them softly enough, they might not feel as real. But they did. They landed with a weight that made everything else in the room fade even further into the background. Before the wedding. That meant all the planning, all the conversations, all the time we spent building what I thought was our future together had been happening alongside something else, something I didn't know about. "How long before?" I asked, even though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. She hesitated again, and this time I didn't push. I just watched her, waiting, letting the silence do the work. "A few months," she said finally, and I felt something inside me drop at those words. Months, not days, not a single mistake. Months of something I had completely missed. I leaned back slowly, the distance between us growing again, not just physically, but in a way that felt impossible to measure. Because suddenly, I wasn't just questioning that one moment in the hallway, I was questioning everything. Every memory from those past months, every interaction, every time she said she was busy or distracted or tired, all of it took on a new meaning, a new context that I couldn't ignore. "And him?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. She nodded slightly, not trusting her voice this time. Of course it was him. My best man. The person I trusted enough to stand beside me on the most important day of my life. The person who gave a speech about loyalty, about friendship, about how much our bond meant to him. The irony of it felt almost unreal, like something out of a story I wouldn't have believed if I hadn't lived it myself. I ran a hand through my hair, trying to steady myself, trying to hold on to something that still made sense. But there wasn't much left, because in that moment, everything I thought was solid started to feel uncertain. Everything I thought I knew started to feel like a version of the truth, not the truth itself. And the worst part was realizing how easily it had all been hidden, how it had existed right there in the middle of my life without me ever noticing. Until now. The room felt smaller, like the walls were closing in, like there wasn't enough space for everything that was happening. I stood up without really thinking about it, pacing a few steps away from the couch, trying to create distance not just from her, but from the situation itself. But distance didn't help. It didn't change what I had seen, or what she had just told me. Why? The question came out sharper this time, more direct, because at that point I didn't care about softening anything. I needed to understand, or at least I needed to try. She looked up at me, her eyes finally meeting mine again, and for a moment I thought she might actually give me a real answer, something honest, something that made sense. But instead, she shook her head slightly. "I don't know," she said. And that was somehow worse than anything else she could have said, because "I don't know" doesn't explain anything. It doesn't give you something to hold on to, something to process. It just leaves you with more questions. "You don't know?" I repeated, disbelief creeping into my voice again. "You don't know why you did this?" She didn't respond right away, and that silence felt intentional this time, like she was choosing not to say more rather than struggling to find the words. And that choice told me something, because it meant there were answers. She just wasn't willing to give them. "It just happened," she said again, and I felt something inside me snap at that repetition, because it wasn't true. Things like that don't just happen. They build, they grow, they require decisions, choices made over time. And every one of those choices had been made while I was right there, unaware, trusting, believing in something that wasn't as real as I thought it was. I turned away slightly, running my hands over my face, trying to clear my head, trying to find some way to process everything without completely losing control. But it was getting harder, because every answer she gave only led to more questions, and every question brought me further away from the version of reality I had been living in just hours earlier. And at that point, I started to realize something I hadn't considered before. This wasn't just about what had happened, it was about what was going to happen next, because there was no going back from this, no way to unsee what I had seen, or unhear what she had just told me, and whatever came after this moment was going to define everything that followed. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was heavy, filled with everything that had already been said and everything that hadn't. I stood there for a while, not moving, not speaking, just letting the reality of the situation settle in around me. It felt surreal, like I was watching it happen from the outside, instead of living it myself. "Does he know I saw this?" I asked, my voice calmer now, but not because I felt better. It was the kind of calm that comes when something inside you shuts down, when the initial shock fades and leaves something colder in its place. She shook her head. "No," she said. "He doesn't know." I nodded slowly, processing that, because that meant there was still a version of this story that hadn't reached him yet, a version where he was still unaware that everything had been exposed. And for a brief moment, I wondered what that would look like, what it would feel like to confront him, to see his reaction when he realized that the truth wasn't hidden anymore. But that thought didn't last long, because the focus kept coming back to her, to us, or whatever was left of that. "So what now?" I asked, and this time there was no edge in my voice, just a simple question, one that didn't have an easy answer. She looked at me again, her expression softer now, almost pleading, but I couldn't read it the way I used to. Everything felt different. "I don't want to lose you," she said, and those words might have meant something to me before, but now they felt disconnected from everything else that had happened, because if that were true, none of this would have existed in the first place. "You already did," I said quietly, and I could see the impact of those words immediately, but they weren't said out of anger, they were just true, because whatever we had before that moment was gone, replaced with something else, something fractured and uncertain, and no matter what happened next, it wasn't going to be the same. I turned back toward the screen one last time, looking at the images that had started all of this. Those photos weren't just evidence, they were a turning point, a moment where everything shifted from one version of reality to another, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized that as painful as it was, I'm almost grateful for them, because without them, I might never have known. I might have kept living in a version of the truth that wasn't real. And as much as this hurt, at least it was honest. I didn't confront him right away, not because I didn't want to, but because I needed to understand what I was walking into. I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with before I made the next move. But eventually, there was no avoiding it. I called him. Simple, direct, no explanation over the phone, just told him we needed to talk. When he arrived, everything felt strangely normal at first. He greeted me the same way he always did, like nothing had changed, like we were still standing in that version of reality where none of this existed. And for a split second, I almost questioned myself again. Almost. But then I remembered the photos. I remembered the conversation. And just like that, any doubt disappeared. "We need to talk," I said again, this time in person, and something in my tone must have registered, because his expression shifted slightly. Not enough to reveal anything, but enough to show that he knew this wasn't a casual conversation. I didn't waste time. I pulled out my phone, opened the gallery, and turned the screen toward him. For a moment, he didn't react. He just looked at the image, his eyes scanning it slowly, like he was trying to process what he was seeing. And then it hit him. I saw it in the way his posture changed, in the way his face tightened, in the way he looked away for just a second too long. "It's not," he started, but stopped himself before finishing the sentence, because there was no point. There was no version of that sentence that would have made sense. "Don't," I said, cutting him off before he could try again. The silence that followed was different from the one I had shared with her. This one felt heavier, more confrontational, like it was waiting for something to break. "How long?" I asked again, repeating the question I had already asked once before, but this time directed at him. He hesitated, just like she had, and that hesitation was all the confirmation I needed, because it meant the answer wasn't simple, it wasn't short. "A while," he said finally, and that vague response only made everything worse. "A while," I repeated, letting the words hang in the air. "That's what you're going with?" He didn't respond. He didn't try to explain or defend or justify, and in that moment I realized something that hit harder than anything else. Neither of them had fought for it. Neither of them had tried to convince me that it wasn't what it looked like, because they couldn't, because it was exactly what it looked like. And that was the moment everything reached its peak. Not just the anger or the betrayal, but the clarity, the undeniable understanding that what I had believed in was never as solid as I thought it was, and everything I did next would have to come from that truth.
The hours that followed felt disconnected, like pieces of time that didn't quite fit together.
Conversations blurred into arguments. Arguments faded into silence. And through it all, there was a constant sense that something irreversible had already happened. Because it had. There was no version of events where things went back to the way they were, no reset button, no way to undo what had been seen and said. She tried to explain more, to fill in the gaps with details that didn't really matter anymore, when it started, how it happened, what it meant. But none of it changed the core of the situation. None of it made it easier to accept. And him? He kept his distance after that initial conversation. A few messages, a couple of attempts to reach out, but nothing that felt genuine enough to matter. It was like he knew there was nothing he could say that would fix it, so he didn't try. And in a way, that almost made it worse, because it confirmed that this wasn't something either of them were willing or able to fight for, not in a way that would have made a difference. Days passed, then weeks, and slowly the intensity of the moment began to fade, replaced by something quieter, something more reflective. The anger didn't disappear, but it changed. It became less sharp, less immediate, turning into something that lingered in the background instead of dominating every thought. And in that space, I started to see things more clearly. Not just what had happened, but what it meant, because as painful as it was, it forced me to confront something I might have ignored otherwise. The reality of the situation, stripped of the illusions I had built around it. And as difficult as that process was, it was also necessary, because it allowed me to move forward, even if that meant leaving certain things behind. And in the end, that's exactly what I did. I've replayed that moment more than I can count, the instant I opened that photo, the second everything shifted, and every time I come back to the same realization. It wasn't just about what I saw, it was about what it revealed, because the truth was already there long before that image ever reached me. It existed in moments I didn't notice, in choices I wasn't aware of, in a version of reality that was unfolding just outside of my view. The photo didn't create the truth, it exposed it. And as painful as that was, it also gave me something I didn't have before: clarity, a chance to see things as they really were, not as I wanted them to be. And that's something a lot of people never get. A lot of people live their lives without ever realizing what's happening just beyond their line of sight. They stay in that comfortable version of reality, even when it's not entirely real. I didn't get that option, and as much as it hurt, I'm grateful for that now, because it forced me to confront something I might have ignored for much longer. It forced me to make decisions based on truth, not assumption. And in the end, that's what allowed me to move forward. Not perfectly, not without scars, but honestly. If this story moved you the way it moved me, hit subscribe. I share stories like this every week that most people never hear. Drop a comment below and tell me what part hit you the hardest. And if someone in your life needs to hear this, send it to them right now. I'll see you in the next one, because sometimes the moments we're not meant to see are the ones that change everything.